Michel Foucault is often taken to be an enemy of naturalism and of a naturalistic ethics, but is he really? Does Foucault give any good reasons for rejecting the principle that nature judges culture? Does Foucault really disagree with John Dewey? And John Dewey says that institutions, philosophies, ethics are hypotheses, which are to be evaluated by their consequences. So Dewey tells us that institutions ought to be reformed when they are defective, and they're defective if they fail to assure that everyone has food, clean water, pure air, shelter against the cold and heat, and medical care. That's what Dewey says. Now, some people would say, Foucault would say, that institutions that do not facilitate basic security for all are simply other institutions, other cultures, other experiences, miserable ones that people in the course of history happen to have. It seems clear to me that if you really asked him, Foucault would agree with Dewey. I think he would take the first and not the second option, judging by Foucault's practical political activities and also by the favorable impression he had of Swedish social democracy when he was cultural attaché of the French embassy in Uppsala. So this would be my resolution of my doubts about the passage that we talked about last time, where Foucault has so much to say about the lyricism of unreason, the lyrisme de la déraison. This lyricism of unreason in a good society, Dewey would say, I would say, should be physically functional. I think if you asked Foucault, he would have said so, but nobody ever asked him, so maybe we don't really know what he would have said. But in any case, I don't think he gave any good reasons why such prosaic achievements as ending hunger, medical care for all, I don't think he gave any good reasons why we should not consider desirable and ethically mandatory serving others and achieving these physical objectives for the welfare of the human species. But anyway, quite apart from the functions of the lyricism of unreason or the functions of mystique and charm, as Arnold Toynbee would say, quite apart from their functions in making life work, people simply need the lyricism of unreason. I'm confident that Foucault would agree, although I use language he didn't use, that people need mystical experiences. They need them so badly that if they get them nowhere else, they'll get them from going to rock concerts or going to filling the stadiums at football matches and having a frenzied being carried away by the crowd and the excitement of the game. People go to fiestas or parties that last all night. People engage in experimental sex. They engage in drug abuse. They engage in violence. If they don't get excitement one way from religion or from art, they get it another. So this need for the lyricism of unreason is both intrinsic and instrumental. It's instrumental because the social structures that do not cultivate it collapse in quarrels. For lack of charm, they do not maintain workable human relationships. They do not succeed in meeting even basic physical needs because, in the language of Hannah Arendt, they fail at the art of living together. Okay, now my next remark, which is number 10, if anybody's counting. I'm reasonably certain that Foucault would agree with the critical realist that society should adjust to physical reality in order to provide concrete benefits for its members. Nevertheless, what he emphasizes is a different point. Namely, what he emphasizes is that people who claim to know what reality is and how to adjust to it, they abuse their position as possessors or so-called possessors of knowledge. That is, knowledge becomes a form of tyranny that Foucault exposes. Doctors and other experts exercise unwarranted control over other people's bodies on the pretext that they, the experts, know what people's needs are and how to meet them. But surely neither Foucault nor anyone else would deny that there are physical needs and that they would exist, even if there were no doctors, even if there were no charlatans who are busy pretending to have knowledge in order to be on a power trip and not actually to do anyone any good except themselves. Now I think that all of this leads to the next book that Foucault published. We've already said a little bit about Madness and Civilization, his doctoral dissertation, and we'll say more about it. The next book he published after that was a sort of a follow-up. Madness and Civilization is a sort of expose of psychiatry, and his next book is sort of an expose of medicine. Medicine as such. It's La Naissance de la Clinique, the birth of the clinic, which he finished writing in 1961, but it wasn't published until 1963. Now this book continues the humanist and anti-positivist work of the book on madness. Its general thesis is that the medical gaze, what Foucault calls le regard médical, the medical gaze, should not be taken for granted as a part of nature. For it's a product of history that could only come into existence after the historical conditions of its possibility were met. Let's see, it is an undesirable product of history in that under the medical gaze, the human being becomes a case, an object. However, so much of this book is about historical facts that it could almost pass for materialist history. And indeed, Louis Althusser thought it was materialist history. Much of it could have been written by Fernand Braudel or by Emmanuel Wallerstein. The clinical experience, the experience of diagnosis of the patient at the clinic, arose out of the rough and tumble of political struggles, out of a series of efforts to reorganize medical practice to make it work in the aftermath of the French Revolution. As so often in Foucault, the French Revolution and the period after becomes a sort of founding period when modernity takes shape. And that's the case with medicine. The old faculties of medicine, which had been part of the old regime and the old ideologies, had been closed by the revolution. They said, we don't want no more of this nonsense. They simply closed the faculties of medicine. But there were still people who needed doctors. They were still sick. Something had to be done to reconstitute some way of caring for the sick. But Foucault adds a non-naturalistic dimension, a Heideggerian one, to his otherwise Braudelian history of medicine. Or to put it the other way around, Foucault, coming from a background strongly marked by phenomenological studies with Merleau-Ponty and of Heidegger, and following out early Heidegger's principle that the human being is through and through interpretive and historical, and following it out with a personal passion to redeem outcasts and to expose the frauds of those who invoke science to abuse power, is in the birth of the clinic in the process of becoming more and more immersed in history's material details. Foucault's methodology coincides with his way of looking at the history of science. Science's very categories change in time. In this respect, science is no different from myth. Myths and science both change their categories over time. You can see this in a book review that Foucault wrote in 1961 of Alexandre Corret's book on the revolutions in astronomy, where Corret advances the thesis that science, like myth, changes its story from time to time and it makes up different stories. And Foucault was an enthusiastic reviewer of Corret's book. So it's not simply the case that after shutting down the old medical establishment, the French Revolution had to reorganize medicine somehow to provide for the health of the people. It's rather that the very possibilities of thinking and seeing medicine, of thinking and seeing health, of thinking and seeing people, are historically contingent and hotly contested, often violently contested. In the new order, that of the modern clinic, the doctor, or the apprentice in training to be a doctor, or maybe even the nurse, or more impersonally, le regard médical, the medical glance. And this happens in Foucault's sentences. In Foucault's sentences, the medical glance can become a subject. It's the medical glance that is the subject of the sentence that sees the case as an object. So the medical glance sees the patient, takes the pulse, measures the heartbeat, weighs the patient, asks questions, listens to the patient's self-reports, examines the body, checks the temperature, and diagnoses. Well, what goes on with the diagnosis? I'm following Foucault here. What goes on in the diagnosis is that in the signs, the doctor sees symptoms. Symptoms of what? Symptoms of the underlying cause, the disease. Given the underlying cause, the patient's condition can be expected to develop, give or take individual differences, the same as other cases with the same diagnosis develop. It can be treated with the same remedies. So the sign-symptom structure of the diagnosis is, Foucault points out, like an etiology. Etiology as a sort of empiricist theory of science, a systematic study of ideas that the student de Tracy proposed when he coined the word etiology. It follows the same pattern in relating words to things as other etiologies. Oh, this is an X, this is a Y, this is a Z. It's the etiology that sort of classifies and tells us what sign is a sign of what symptom, which is a symptom of what underlying disease. Well, okay, Foucault says that the regard, or the look, is fondateur. In other words, the look establishes the object of discourse. It's the regard médical, the medical glance, that establishes the object of discourse. It tells us, well, this is a patient. This is a patient with heart disease. This is a patient with pneumonia. This is a patient with tuberculosis. So in some sense, the regard is fondateur. The glance establishes the meaning. But now let's put on another hat. We'll have another hat. Let's put on the hat of the critical realist. The critical realist would say, well, if the correct diagnosis is that the patient has measles, the reason why the diagnosis is correct is that the patient has measles. Measles is the physical reality that the doctor has detected. You don't necessarily have to use the word measles. You might be speaking Arabic or Hindi or some other language, in some other way. You might even have a different culture with a different mythological system and reconstruct the whole pattern altogether. But nevertheless, in some important sense, the patient either has measles or doesn't. I don't think anywhere Michel Foucault specifically denies this point. He says that the regard establishes the object of discourse, but he doesn't really deny the critical realist point that whatever culture may say, there is a physical reality that culture needs to adjust to. Whether the patient has measles depends on the presence or absence of certain germs in the blood and tissues, which have certain molecular structures. Of course, the critical realist admits these are socially constructed realities. It was a certain social practice, namely chemistry, that invented the notion of molecule. But it's an important sense the molecular structure of measles germs can be counted as a social reality, but those are ideologies too. They're part of the discourse of chemistry and bacteriology, but adds the critical realist in an important sense, there's something else. There's an important sense, there is a physical reality, and we depend on it more than it depends on us. Okay, I refer here to Bhaskar for those who want to read more, Roy Bhaskar, who want to read more on this point. So I'm not going to give reasons why critical realism is a plausible position to hold vis-a-vis other contemporary philosophical positions, because that would repeat unnecessarily what you can read if you look up in Wikipedia critical realism or Roy Bhaskar or Ram Hare, who was a predecessor of critical realism, or Margaret Archer or others. So I'll go on to my remark number 12. That was 11. Okay, now acknowledging the existence of physical realities is a step toward acknowledging the need to change social realities, so that the social realities will in turn change physical realities, which will in turn change social realities again, hopefully, if all goes well, favoring a non-authoritarian authority by making a society's norms more respectable and more respected because the norms are working better at a physical level. Social realities change physical realities not only because discourses define their objects, as in the case of madness talk, creating the category of insane and placing certain persons in it. The social changes the physical also because human action guided by conventional rules changes what physically happens. For example, the futures today of plant and animal species depend less on the random mutation and natural selection that Darwin studied, and they depend more on human beings. Human beings, the relationship of species to human beings, to the burning of the Amazon, to run more cattle, to the overfishing of the seas, to the pollution of the atmosphere. It's the conduct of human beings guided by culture, by conventional norms, that determines the physical fate and possibly very likely the extinction of other plant and animal species. The future of a species today is likely to depend on whether urbanization will destroy its habitat or whether sometimes it works the other way. For example, in Los Angeles, California, the coyotes have a new habitat alongside the freeways. The coyotes live along the freeways, and the shrubs, they're rats hiding in the shrubs, and the coyote lives on the rats. So human construction of highways in the form of freeways with plants on their borders has created a new habitat for the coyote. Or heating of waters and human CO2 emissions is moving the temperatures of many ocean creatures out of the range where those creatures can live. But the activities of Homo sapiens, that's us, our ways our particular species interchanges matter and energy with the environment, they are driven by prevailing cultural structures, notably by capital accumulation. It's still true that human activities are driven by a capital accumulation, or that is to say by the pursuit of profit, to a major extent, certainly to a large enough extent to impact the future of many species, even after we take account of the endless attacks against totalizing theories that have proliferated since May of 1968. The conventional social rules that organize commerce, conducted for the purpose of turning money into more money, explain a lot. They don't explain everything, but they explain a lot, even though they don't explain everything, and even though one can grant that the people who say every total theory must be wrong have a point. Every total theory must be wrong. Nonetheless, the world keeps churning out at a physical level results that a certain cultural pattern, namely the pattern of turning money into more money as a way of organizing economic activity, generates. Okay, make another remark here, which is number 13. As I'm writing this, I'm not writing it now, I wrote it earlier. When I was writing it, I was in Valparaiso, Chile, in a hotel. And outside my hotel, poor people were on the sidewalks. I was just looking out the window of this little hotel, the Bristol Hotel in Valparaiso. And there were poor people trying to sell trinkets, things that nobody really needs and nobody really wants. So the basic conventional rules, the ones derived from commercial law, which is derived from Roman law, explain and animate what they're doing. They need to sell something to get some money so they can buy something so they can live. They were doing a kind of selling that really amounts to begging, because a tourist is really more likely to buy something from them just from sympathy than because the tourist really wants what they have to sell. It's a combination of selling and begging that could easily turn into stealing if one of these people trying to sell something should catch a tourist in a dark alley. Their pain and their needs are physical realities, even though there are many layers of cultural interpretation intervening between the cellular level and the experienced in der Weltsein, the experienced in the meaning, in the world being, in this world where people live our conscious lives where the sun comes up in the east and the sun sets in the west and there's an evening star and a morning star. So this is a contemporary, impoverished Latin American urban Dasein. They are physical realities interwoven with the legal norms written into the civil code that define them as without property, without even a place to sleep, because they have no money to pay rent, they have no land that they own, and it's illegal to sleep in the sidewalk, but they sleep in the sidewalk anyway, even though it's illegal. Okay, remark number 14. A reporter from Le Monde in 1961 asked Michel Foucault who was it who inspired the methodology that he employed in his doctoral dissertation, the Madness and Civilization, or Histoire de la Folie. Well, Foucault mentioned Maurice Blanchot and Raymond Roussel, and one specialist, two literary authors, two authors of fiction who had influenced him, and one specialist in the study of religious myth, one specialist in the study of the religious myths of ancient India, Georges Dumézil, who had been a professor who had consulted concerning the thesis. Okay, what do we make of that? Well, if we look at Histoire de la Folie, if we look at the text, we find on page 140, page 166, page 178, in many pages, sort of very clear evidence that Martin Heidegger is the great methodological inspiration for Foucault at this point. But we're in France in 1961. That's not very long after World War II. French people didn't want to hear that a French philosopher had been inspired by a German, certainly not a German who had been rector of Heidelberg under the Nazis. So I think Foucault had a reason for not mentioning Foucault, even though anyone who reads the text Foucault had a reason for not mentioning Heidegger. So he said my influences were two novelists, Blanchot and Roussel, and a specialist in myths. And that's where I got my methodology for Madness and Civilization. Okay, now let's engage in a little speculation. Let's pretend it's 1961. 1970s haven't happened yet. The late 1960s haven't happened yet. The Paris Spring, the student revolt hasn't happened yet. The 80s haven't happened yet. We don't know what's going to happen next. And let's suppose that we're speculating, having read the writings of Michel Foucault so far, what's he going to write next? What will be the next step in his intellectual career? Well, we might say his interest in language and myths might lead him to study language games as episodes in the natural histories of human beings, sort of a Wittgensteinian turn. Or he might have decided to write a scientific history of culture. So he had already written a history of insanity, he had written a history of medicine, and maybe now he would turn to a history of culture. And perhaps when he did that, he would analyze the material conditions that influence the generation, growth, and selective survival of symbol systems. That's one way you could actually read Madness and Civilization that way. You could read The Birth of the Clinic that way. And as I mentioned, Louis Althusser did read it that way. This is a materialist account of how certain symbol systems come to survival. Okay, given that he'd chosen not to tell the reporter from Le Monde that Heidegger was a major influence, in spite of his numerous employment of Heideggerian ideas, we might guess that he's backing away from Heidegger. He might have written the material history of juridical myths that constitute the conditions of possibility of the concrete experiences of entrepreneurs, accountants, lawyers, and economists. Indeed, he'd already advanced in that direction by writing about the concrete experiences of doctors and patients when he wrote The Birth of the Clinic. He had already finished that by the end of 1961, even though he didn't publish it for a while. He might have written a study, and this could be read as a study of how the forces of history had shaped the culture of the medical profession. Okay, that's what we might speculate. But what actually happened? Well, we know, or at least we're told by a reliable informant, that on Christmas Day of 1961, the very day after he finished writing The Birth of the Clinic, he immediately began his next book. Actually, he began an article that grew into a book, and it was on one of those novelists that he had named as influences, namely Ramon Roussel. This became a book on a purely literary subject. Raymond Roussel, an admirer of Jules Verne, who wrote entirely imaginary, entirely fictitious work, sort of experiments in the imagination. Well, my suspicion is that having gotten into writing history, remember why he said he was going to study history? He said he was going to study history because that's what's truly human about human beings. Remember, he hated positivist psychology. Positivist psychology had turned humans into objects. But by studying history, the real history of the human being, we can get to what is really human about human beings. But having gotten into it, he found himself getting into historical materialism. When he wrote about the history of madness, he found out that these insane people, and the people who were starting to be declared insane in the middle of the 17th century, were all sort of rounded up and put in so-called hospitals by order of the king. Why? Because they were a surplus population roaming the countryside that nobody needed or wanted. They didn't fit into the economy. It's not that there were technically too many people. The population of France was much less then than it was when Foucault lived. But they were people who the economy didn't need, a surplus population. So maybe it's the other way around. Maybe people are rejected by society and that drives them crazy. Maybe it's not entirely right to say that people, because they're crazy, are rejected by society. So he was getting into the sort of thing that his old professor could think was Marxist history, which was the last thing he intended. He didn't want that. So my suspect is he moved in his next book to do something clearly literary that emphasized the role of the imagination in determining experience, indeed the role of the imagination in making experiences possible, veering away from a direction he sort of found himself slipping into but didn't really want to go. And this became even clearer 5 years later when he published Words and Things, Les mots et les choses, which was a book that Jean-Paul Sartre immediately recognized as a disguised polemic against materialist accounts of history. So let's stop for now, and next time we'll go into Raymond Roussel and the function of the literary imagination in creating realities and making it possible to experience them.